Okay, Battle of Adobe Walls. Ouch. The Indian Wars of the American West. This was the first of the series. I assume they all use pretty much the same system. It is a very similar type of design in a lot of ways to more classic, gunpowder era tactical games that cover much larger battles. Because of the size of the battles, the scale of the units involved, etc., a greater degree of detail in terms of the specifics of these smaller unit activities is being investigated in this. And that's got pluses and minuses. Obviously, when you're looking at a smaller scale type engagement, it kind of feels right to zoom in more detail. You can't just work with conglomerate data over hundreds of men anymore. You're looking at tens of men instead. And results can be more extreme when you're looking at that, more off the angle. So specific morale effects, specific little impacts can be a fairly major factor in how the battle outcome will be addressed. And that comes with a certain level of complexity that may be pushing it just a little too far for me. And not so much that the rules are overly complex, more mechanical complexity, what people sometimes call fiddliness or whatever, is taking effect here. There are some innovative solutions in this design, though, and overall it's similar enough to things that are common or have been around for a long time that you could largely pick it up pretty easily. But some of the places where it's a little off that normal beaten track, which are because of the scale more than anything else, may cause issues. And also, you may actually find difficulty, getting used to some of the factors that I actually think are the brightest of it. Component-wise, decent. It's Legion. Biggest plus is real paper on the rule book in terms of components. You have these charts, two sets of charts basically of each type that needs it, the howitzer, the ammo, and the sequence of play is showing you, part of the rules, which is what the different units have, are all just a single copy, but both players have a fire and melee table. There's a lot of blank space wasted. I don't know why that choice was made. It's not a negative in terms of play. If anything, it might actually be a slight positive. You don't have to flip tables over so much. I don't know. It just seems cost-wise, that's kind of iffy. My printer is not so hot. One biggie about the ammo roster, it doesn't cover everything the rules say should be covered on it. There are ways around that. You could obviously draw in more boxes, which seems kind of, I don't know, sad. But the other side of, especially given that, there's a fair amount of repeating information from the rules on this sheet. So it's not like there was a real space thing. They could have removed that to give the additional pieces for scouts, essentially. But another option is to just say, well, the scouts use the basic firing yeah, ammunition rolls. The map is glossy. The counters are glossy. I don't usually like both being glossy, but it wasn't really a problem here. Map laid flat enough. The counters are. This is something Legion has done in a couple of games. I don't know how many. And I don't know if they're sticking with it because once I've gotten more recently, I've had to punch out and trim. These are sort of a no punch set of counters. They just kind of, they're in a bag and you pull that out and they just sort of fall out of the counter tray. They're so punched through automatically, which means there's almost no defects on any of them. And without the defects, I found that it would just be a waste of the time to clip them, even though it feels alien to be seeing these corners. I mean, when I use side-mounted counters, maybe I'm getting less anal about that and just filing off the little sprue or whatever where it attaches. But I used to clip all of those just to give them that, rounded corner look. But I just could not justify it with this. Okay, what about the system itself? What can we say? What can we say? So, take a look. Stacking limits are quite large for a game of this type, and that's really a matter of the hexes cover a lot of ground and the pieces don't. And again, it's the scale of the battle. It's a small battle, but covering a large amount of space, and there didn't seem to be a reason to scale the battle down. In fact, the hexes are quite large. The firing range, and we're talking about towards the end of the Civil War, the firing range is 2 hexes in distance for max range for rifles. And that's not, that's not, if you look at something like a regimental game like TSS or some of the gamers, what is it, the Line of Battle series. I played a couple of them, but it doesn't stick in my head the way CWB does. There, the firing ranges go out like 5 hexes or so. So obviously, there's a decision to cover a lot more ground on a single map than you would take in some of these larger battles. It seems to work okay. One thing that's notable is there's no differentiation of the weapons type. So I'm talking about, wow, there's more detail than you would expect. Yeah, but all the all the U.S. troops, it's the time period, man, it's the Union. All the U.S. troops basically fire with the same weaponry, a uniform weapon. Now, in the scenario I was playing, that weapon is the carbine, but the infantry have certain advantages in firing. Trying to see where the differentiation is. They certainly have an advantage in they have an advantage in melee. I seem to remember they had an advantage in firing, but I'm not really seeing that on the charts. Yeah, I think their big advantage is in melee. They were armed with a different kind of rifle that I believe actually had a longer range and was more accurate towards the end of the war. At least though, well, I'm not sure. See, that's the thing. I'm not sure what they were armed with here. And I didn't bother to look that up. It would seem rather odd that they would have the same firing capabilities that the carbines do. So again, that's kind of weird that level of detail wasn't dealt with here. organization. So you have formation changes, as you would in many of these games, and it's not too complicated. It generally costs you a movement point to change formation, and that's usually going to be mounting up, but it might be lying down on the ground. It's not, column versus line and stuff like that. But the equivalent to that is, well, and I think this is a clever way to handle things. Disorganized is not something that becomes rallied. It's something that's handled as a reforming the unit. You're tightening up the lines and everything. The morale's not hurt. The unit just needs to, obtain a better formation. And I think that's kind of a clever way to look at it. I can see arguments the other way, so I'm not going to, say this is the definitive. Another factor that I really liked is the movement rate. And this is the thing that I found the most clever, which is that units have a uniform movement allowance that's not affected by their formation. Instead, their movement cost is all that's affected. Now, most games, we're talking about pretty much a difference between mounted and dismounted. Most games, mounted units pay a heavier cost to go through certain kinds of terrain, like woods or whatever, and they have more movement allowance when you change formation, and that creates some complexity around changing formation. You can't just say it costs you a movement point, because you have to figure out what happens if you move a little bit in one mode and then switch modes and move some more movement in that other mode, and that can create a more complex rule system. This one created a much cleaner system where you have a certain amount of movement points, you spend a fixed value to change formation or mode of transport, and then your movement point costs for all the different hexes, which had to be tracked separately in the earlier systems anyway, change. So, mounted units move paying 1 movement point in general, dismounted pay 2 in general. You put somebody in a complicated situation like where there was woods or something, and they both move the same. They both spend the same kind of movement point allowance. It feels very flexible, very natural, very intuitive, and I'm shocked that I haven't seen this before. I don't know if this is the first time it's been done, but I think it's, pretty damn bright. Verging on sheer brilliance. But it's one of those little changes that doesn't quite meet expectations for this type of system. So it's not trivial to get used to. By the way, when I did my playthrough, I was pulling my Union forces away. I completely forgot, once I got serious about trying to run away, I completely forgot about setting fire to stuff. It probably had no effect on the overall outcome, but it might have slowed down the pursuit a little bit. Definitely could have bought me some ground when I was behind the Canadian River. Fire combat. Okay, so this is handled a little differently too. We don't have like this matrix of weapons types or anything like that. What we have, though, is something similar, which is what you are in terms of armaments, and all the U.S. troops are basically given the same armaments. All the Indian forces are given the same armaments. Now, with the Indians, there's no homogeny in the weaponry. I mean, there's so many different types. It's basically what they were able to scavenge and pick up. You're not talking about a uniformly organized force. How would you assign them a specific weapon? For the U.S. forces, again, the only thing I would say here is I don't believe that the infantry were armed with exactly the same weapon. Well, I know they weren't armed with exactly the same weapon. What I don't believe is that they'd have the same firing profile at all ranges, and again, that may be abstracting things away that I would have expected covered in more detail in a game like this. Another thing is effects like pinned don't prevent you from firing in general. They prevent the artillery from firing, but and instead what they do is they reduce the strength of the fire. And and strength is just basically going to be you cross-reference the number of strength points that are firing from a given unit with the mode that they're in. Dismounted is your best mode for firing. Mounted is harder. It's harder to fire from on a horse. And prone, again, you're making a trade-off, taking defensive terrain, while taking a defensive position that reduces your firepower. I don't think any of my units ever went prone. And then you roll on 2d6. You have a bunch of modifiers based on the target's situation, and where mounted actually makes it easier to hit. This is an iffy situation. Like I've got mixed feelings about this. On one side, mounted means you're presenting a larger target, but on another side, you're probably more mobile, and I think overall they got it right. I think it's easier to hit mounted units than dismounted, but in this period. But yeah, I mean, it's something to keep in mind is that there's more than one factor going into the decisions here, and it may depend on what you're actually doing. And again, more abstraction layered in. Density in the hex. The more people packed into the hex, the tighter they're going to be, so the easier it is. But you're aiming at a specific unit. These hexes are quite large. I don't know how much that makes a difference. So for, I'm just really not sure that if you've got one unit with 5 or less strength points, that's probably acting kind of close together. That's significantly different than 2 such units getting you, say, in the 6 to 10 strength point range, both operating close together but separated? Or are you just assuming that they're uniformly spread out throughout the hex or something, which seems a bit ridiculous, to tell you the truth, or frontage-wise? Again, you could argue either way. Also on this table, you have leader loss check. Whenever you take certain hits, you're going to make a roll. There's multiple rolls for the leader loss check. If you end up getting wounded, there's actually a significantly detailed set of rules for wounding. It's not going to happen very often, so whatever. Let's see. And morale checks, which are impacted by the amount of losses you have. Now, they can result in a number of different statuses. A rout, which is very similar to the routes that you're used to. Pin, which is less effective than a usual pin. You're pinned into place, you're not going to be able to move around, but you're still able to fire at half strength. So that's a thing. And disrupted, which again, that's your formation's a little disrupted. It's very easy to recover from, but it only happens in your own turn. Same with the others, they only happen in your own turn, actually. But different points in the turn. Melee table. Did we get that? Sure. The way melee is done is with an odds ratio. That's pretty common in these types of games. But again, the differences of weapons, training, whatever aptitudes they have, is represented where the U.S. use a different table than the Indians. The Indians are more armed with the concept of getting into that close combat, more weapons to facilitate that rather than just your sort of improvised pike of a bayonet or, a rifle stock. Firepower is still taken into account here. This is a little strange because this is the point where you're most likely to actually fire, and if you're at low ammo, by basic rules, is the only way this would happen. Or if you're out of ammo in the advanced rules, your strength is halved. Now, in the advanced rules, it makes sense. In the basic rules, not so much, because if there's any time when you're going to be firing your rounds off, it's when you're being charged, when they're within like 5 yards of you or whatever. Yeah, you're not gonna hold off on firing around at that point. Multiple different terrain types can affect it. Okay, so here's where we get to some of the more complex things, I guess. When you're being melee attacked, you can make a check to retreat before melee. It's a check, and you'll undergo. You may undergo the melee anyway. You may fail to make it. There's a chance you could become disrupted. Nothing worse than that from it, but that's going to impact. If you're disrupted when you get hit, that's going to hurt your defensive capability. See what else. And then if you do retreat, there's a chance that you can be pursued. So the melee may end up just moving a couple of hexes away or something. Oh. There's a fair number of rules relating to dismounting and what happens to the horses when that happens. Most of the Civil War type games of this type just may abstract at most, if they even bother, the idea of, yeah, there's somebody back there holding their horses, so you have less of the unit in place. Here, it's actually being tracked with units on the board. You can mount other units' horses. Those horses can be chased away, they can be captured, all kinds of stuff like that. And it's chromey type stuff. It definitely improves the story. It's just, I'm not sure that's the part of the story that I'm particularly attracted to. And again, that's the big battle versus this little skirmish type differentiation, where I think the game's doing a good job with it. It's just, I have less interest in that. Artillery. Artillery have their own set of roles and their own set of tables. And again, they have a firepower table, which generally is just going to push the enemy back. It can cause casualties if you have the enemy close enough. And when they get really, really close and you're firing canister at them, you're going to butcher a lot of them. And this all makes sense because the forces attacking are so small over such a wide area, they're probably spread out pretty far. So your cannonballs aren't going to hit a lot of men at once. But as they get closer, the point of contact, they're probably pulling up closer together anyway. So you actually do have a chance of hitting in addition to whatever range effects you have. You have a bunch of rules to handle. Hey, what happens if you try to move over difficult terrain with these howitzers? What happens when you're hand hauling them? There are chances that you can just break them. And again, that's a level of detail you usually don't see in the games. That feels appropriate, you know. You're talking about a single gun here now, not, a battery of 3 to 5 guns or whatever. So in the other cases, you'd probably be looking at the possibility of like breaking the unit apart or something along those lines, if that were it. Let me take a look at the factors to see if there's anything I really wanted to discuss there. Not particularly. Does take leadership into effect. Basically, one leader value applies to a lot of different things: morale, melee combat, etc. And then you also have a range in which they can rally units more effectively, and they may have another effect. I don't remember. I had to look it up. The detail of the advanced ammo tracking system, where you have X number of shots and you mark them off one at a time until you're down, I feel changes the game significantly, and I went into some of that in the second video of it, where I think you're going to get different results depending on whether or not you play with the basic ammo system or the advanced ammo system. And that only applies to the US. Now there's a little bit of a, wow, this is weird, and I already alluded to this with, if you break horse holders off of a unit, they don't have their own separate ammo track, and You're not really keeping track of them as anything, and it's not clear how they're supposed to deal with loss of ammo. No matter what, to tell you the truth, even in the basic game, it's not really clear what's supposed to happen with those units, because if they end up out of ammo and you absorb them into another unit, what happens? You know, and that's for the U.S. only, obviously, because the Indian horse holders, they're pony holders, and they're not old enough to be fighting. There are also a couple of units that are not tracked on here no matter what. Like I said, the scouts are in kind of a gray area. They just didn't make it on here, but I think they're intended to be. The horse holders for a specific unit are again in kind of this gray area. They're not being tracked, but what do you do with them? Again, I don't know, but they can provide you with some defensive fire. And there's the column and the artillery crew, which, again, maybe they're supposed to have their own ammo tracking, but maybe not. And it feels like the advanced ammo tracking rules were kind of tacked on as this will change the game and make it a lot harder on the US. It definitely feels to me like it makes their life more difficult. Although you could get unlucky rolls and run out of ammo in the basic system. But the advanced system doesn't track these things in the same way, and it doesn't really indicate what you should do. You can house rule this. What I did was treated them as if they used the basic the basic ammo system to track their ammo. The horse holders, there really is no good answer for, because they come from another unit, but they don't have their ammo tracked in any way. And what if they end up low ammo? Then you absorb them into a unit. What happens? I just don't know. So there's a lot of rough around the edges in the advanced ammo tracking system, and you can kind of smooth it out, but I think whatever you try to do to fix it just doesn't quite work. And what you end up finding is some units that are intended to only really be for defensive fire, like the column and the gun crew, and the horse holders for that matter, end up shifting over and becoming your best units if you make it so that they're using some form of the basic firepower system, because they kind of they will never fully run out of ammo. The worst they get is low ammo, and they can fire forever as low ammo, which is just weird to me. Bunch of special rules. Cav can charge when mounted. I thought about it a few times, didn't do it. A lot about the horses. Some stuff for things that aren't in the historical battle, but which could have been brought into play. There's basically extra infantry and a pack train. The pack train has boxes that could have been used defensively. You have some other special rules, for example, the grass fires, which I misused and or failed to use and really should have. There's a little bit of weirdness about them. There's a maximum number of grass fires you can put on the board, and either player can put them there. The Indian player could conceivably start burning stuff for no good reason, except just to deprive the U.S. player from being able to set fires, presumably somewhere else on the board, which, I don't know, I guess they're stealing the U.S. Army flint or something. I have no idea. Again, I feel like you'd probably want to come at this game with a wrench or something and fix it a little bit. Given that I did not create any grass fires, I'm not sure why there's a limit on the number of hexes that you can create grass fires throughout the game. But Indian casualties, once they've taken a certain number of casualties, the amount of victory points that they produce for killing them goes up, and eventually they can no longer do melee as easily, pretty much at all, but you need a leader in order to do the melee, and the leaders are very killable in this game, and not replaceable for the Indians. You have this idea of Indian camps. Now, at the beginning of the game, you have one small group of Indians that are alerted, but a whole larger camp that's not yet aware. And you have a few choices as to how to activate them. This is kind of an interesting situation because it would be possible to wipe out that front group. And then if that's done and the U.S. has good victory points, they could just wash their hands and leave. And that's essentially the mission that Carson thought he was on. What happened instead, though, is the larger camp gets alerted and comes swarming forward, and the U.S. troops are not allowed to leave the board until a certain turn, which kind of limits the game. You know, the game goes on for many more turns after that turn, but it's really unlikely the U.S. wants to stick around unless they've wiped everyone out. And so then the Indians end up trickling in. Those camps are worth victory points to the U.S. player. They can either loot them, they can loot them and or burn them. Once they've burned them, they can't loot them anymore. And they get victory points for both these options. They also get a pile of victory points for taking the Adobe walls location, and they get points for grabbing the Indian ponies. Now, this was actually one of the biggest issues I had with the game, is the victory conditions. It felt like my Indians did a pretty damn good job of wiping out Carson's column. They didn't get them all. They didn't get everybody who was under Custer either. But it felt like not quite a little bighorn, but pretty close. I may have taken more casualties with my Indians than I should have, but the game ended up being a minor U.S. victory. And I'm left just kind of shaking my head saying, I don't see... Like, at the beginning of the game, the choice was, is the U.S. just going to be able to wipe out the Kiowa and put the game in their pocket and walk away? Well, that didn't happen. Some of the Kiowa escaped, alerted the other camp. I decided, okay, I'll move forward, grab the Adobe walls. That's worth 5 victory points. And a cannon got captured. Like I said, almost the entire U.S. force got wiped out. There were heavy, heavy casualties on the Indian side. Probably close to 1-to-1. But with the baked-in way the victory points worked, it just felt like, I was constantly losing the game as the Indians. And really had to basically wipe out, to make up for the initial victory over the Kiowa, burning the camps, taking the fort, stuff like that. I basically had to wipe out that entire U.S. column. And even if I had managed that, the best I would have gotten is a draw. I do not see how the victory points, the way they're handled, can lead to an Indian victory. Now, maybe I'm missing something big. The designer does say the Indians are the harder side to play and you have to do them cleverly and all this. I don't know about the magic of that kind of cleverness. I just really do not. They don't have many options other than to use their overwhelming numbers at precise points to try to wipe out the U.S. forces. And anything else they do They could just basically the impetus is on them after the Kiowa camps have been destroyed. As soon as those points are in the bank for the U.S., it's really hard. And then once enough Indian casualties have been had, the cost of Indian casualties goes up in victory points. So it becomes harder and harder. That one-to-one trade-off, that's giving the U.S. twice the victory points that you're getting. Which is why such a bloody situation ended up still being a minor U.S. victory. I think there's a fair amount that needs to be tweaked with this. However, what I saw play out looked like a believable story, which is good enough for me. You know, I can grump and grumble about the victory points and it not being a balanced and fair game because of them, but in the end, that's not really what I care about. What I really care about is that those victory conditions drive believable behavior along with the rest of the rules. And I felt like I had that. So overall, I think it more or less does what it tries to do, other than being a balanced game, which I'm not convinced of at all. In fact, I'm pretty sure it isn't. Overall, I think it does a pretty good job of... Oh, here we go again. Another game. 1 and 2 players are listed here, but it is not a solitaire game at all. I really wish this kind of garbage wouldn't show up on... GMT got in trouble for this, apparently, putting 1 to 2 players on games that don't have a bot or anything, or any solitaire rules, just with the, you could play both sides. Nah, just give me what Avalon Hill used to give me. And they even have it here. They have a solitaire suitability, and they put it at medium-high. And I would say, yep, that's pretty fair. It may even deserve high. But it's not a one-player game. It's two different vectors, and they shouldn't be handled that way. But anyway, I think the game does mostly what it should, from my point of view. The problem is, it's not the kind of battle that really, gives me wood. I was hoping to be more excited by it, and maybe under different circumstances I would be. But yeah, getting used to the new systems and everything, and dealing with such small-scale combat, it just didn't. It didn't excite me the way watching, even a small battle like the Kernstown one from Stonewall gets me more excited, because I'm seeing formations operating. Here, I don't know. I was never really a Cowboys and Indians type of person anyway, so whatever. That's what I got to think about with this one. And I don't know what I do know what we're doing next. Go back a little bit in time.